afternoon, everyone. I'm Alexander Bick. I'm a professor of leadership and public policy here at the Batten School at the University of Virginia. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second panel and the third session of today's conference. This is the William and Carol Stevenson Conference, which, as you've heard, we do every 2 years here at the Miller Center. And our topic, as I think the first panel made abundantly clear, is an extremely timely one: the future of American economic and financial statecraft. So the first, the panel that preceded this one really focused on the stakes that are at play and on a diagnosis of where we are. And what I want to do in this panel is to look at questions, more directly at questions of policy. And as I said, I teach public policy, and a policy is, what is a policy? Students frequently don't ask themselves that question, but a policy is a choice. It's a choice to do something or not to do something else. And so I want to be a little bit more concrete as we try to drill down on a number of the important issues that came up in the last panel, to talk about the choices that the U.S. administration faces right now, how it should think about the risks and opportunities involved in those choices, and ultimately make some recommendations about where we should go. So we're joined once again, and since some will be joining for the first time for this panel, by just a tremendous group of experts. On the screen we have Emily Blanchard, who teaches economics and is a fellow at the Tuck School at Dartmouth College, previously economist at the U.S. Department of State in the Biden administration. Also joining us remotely is Philip Zelikow, who is at Stanford's Hoover Institution, previously a director here at the Miller Center, and served in a number of roles in multiple U.S. administrations. Together with me at the table, we have Yorgos Alianis, who teaches at UVA's Darden School of Business, Peter Harrell, who is a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C., previously served in the Biden administration at the National Security Council as Senior Director for International Economics. We have Henry Farrell, who's joining us from Johns Hopkins, both Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and also at Johns Hopkins main campus in Baltimore. And then finally, Everett Eisenstadt, who is a partner at, forgive me.
It's okay. I know where it is.
You know where it is. You can tell everyone. A partner at Squire Patton Boggs, former deputy assistant to the President for International Economics, and deputy director of the National Economic Council in the Trump administration, first Trump administration. So once again, thank you to all of you for joining us. I'd like to start with some of the issues that came up in the first panel. The last 5 weeks, as we've seen, have been a kind of blistering pace of developments. And so maybe if I can turn to you, Mr. Eisenstadt, just give us a sense, what's already been done? What are the choices that have already been made? What are some of the choices that have been signaled, but we don't know necessarily where they're going to go? And among those, which do you think are the most important? What's the signal and what's the noise?
Yeah, it's a really good topic, and it's a little bit obscured by the day-to-day news cycle because there's so much happening every day, and people are trying to digest it and analyze it. And even if I were to take everything that had happened in the previous 5 weeks, I could spend months dissecting that and thinking about the implications. And we simply don't have that kind of time. And he's not going to allow that kind of time. But I think the most interesting thing to me has been the president's desire and willingness to push the boundaries of executive power in a way we have not seen in many, in my lifetime. And I think that's a fundamental shift that's going to be very difficult to reverse. So if you look across the spectrum and even beyond the economics, but you look on everything from the authority over allocation of congressional funding, USAID, that's a statutory created entity, right? So change it. Taking money, saying you can't spend this money, you need to spend this money. That is pretty incredible. And then even on the tariff authority, which is traditionally within the boundaries of the Congress, to say, I'm going to use this authority in really unprecedented ways. And I could probably, and wish I had the time to go through and really calculate how many unprecedented actions have happened in this amount of time. So the courts are going to digest that. We're getting feedback from the court system. In Congress at this point, you've got the Democrats are a bit in disarray, and you've got the Republicans who are being somewhat passive. I think that's a temporary situation. So there will be both judicial pushback and there will be political pushback, and we have to see where it lands. So that to me is the most important thing to watch, is how is that use of executive power manifested and constrained by political forces and by legal remedies, right? In the interim, companies, which I work with a lot, have to think about, okay, well, how are we going to deal with this? How are we going to react to this? And they're trying to make decisions that are very difficult in an unpredictable environment. I see, things to watch for. Are we really going to see a reallocation of supply chains? Are we really going to see reshoring back into the United States? Are we going, the development of the sovereign wealth fund in the United States is completely, nobody 3 months ago would have said, yeah, let's do this. And now it's very much could become a reality, which would totally change the United States' ability to project power, right, and invest. And I think one of the areas where we haven't been able to accommodate is having the long-term capital allocation and mitigating the risk to incentivize investment in these big infrastructure problems, which are a huge, huge gap. Everything from like our electrical grid to the critical minerals to even, the Baltimore Bridge, for example. I mean, if you're a private sector actor and you're looking at that and saying, okay, I'm going to put this money in here, I may get a change in government, I may get a change in administration, that's a lot of money to put down over a long period of time where you don't know what the regulatory environment's going to be. So I think the development of that capital, the sovereign wealth fund, and perhaps could have a very, very significant impact on the U.S. ability to meet some of our critical needs in infrastructure and financing for very, very complicated projects.
Right, I almost wonder if this is kind of Infrastructure Week Part 2, but with a new vehicle, in other words, to make that happen. Maybe we can drill down a little bit on the tariff piece of this, and I know that several people around the table follow this closely, but Peter, I know you've sort of cataloged some of these recent tariff announcements and decisions. Among those, sort of how do you see those playing out? Which ones do you anticipate are going to hold? Which ones do you anticipate may not? And how do you think about even assessing the impact over the medium term of those choices?
I feel like I actually should ask Everett that question because he knows the president and I do not. But I will give it a go. I actually want to begin by picking up I know where the last panel left off, and actually something Everett put on the table. I mean, I actually think the toolkit, we were grading toolkit at the end of the last panel. I actually think the toolkit is getting more and more interesting too. For example, with the sovereign wealth fund that President Trump has proposed, a very interesting additional tool in the toolkit. And there have been other things too. Like if you look at some of the existing institutions that the government has had over the last couple of years, the U.S. Export-Import Bank, for example, it actually started a couple of interesting new programs, not things that got a ton of press, but a couple of interesting new programs to try to give the U.S. some of that capability to mobilize capital. So I think the toolkit does continue to evolve across the spectrum. But you asked me about tariffs, and I'd make a couple of comments on tariffs. First, what we have seen the president announce has been both substantially quicker and substantially broader than anything he did in his first term. I just want to throw out a couple of data points on that. So the president has announced, actually as of today, there are additional 10% tariffs that are being collected on all imports from China beyond what they were during his first term or during the Biden administration. To put that in perspective, if you look back at his first term, it actually took him about a year and a half to begin imposing any tariffs on China. And then they were laddered up over about a year. And then even with that, because of the phase one trade deal he struck with the Chinese, there are actually fairly broad categories of Chinese-made products that were fully exempt from the tariffs. He never taxed iPhones, for example. He never tariffed laptop computers or TVs. All of those are now subject to this 10% tariff, which as of last week is going to become, as of yesterday, is announced to become 20% on Tuesday of next week. So the speed is much larger. Similar, during his first term, he had steel and aluminum tariffs. He is now, Biden broadly maintained those. Trump has now brought them back with force. He's increasing the rate on steel and aluminum. He is broadening out by a factor of probably 2 to 3 the number of products that are covered. These are global tariffs. They're going to hit March 12th. They're going to cover all steel and aluminum imports. And he eliminated various deals that he himself had struck in his first term, for example, with the Mexicans and the Argentines, to shift away from them. So we're just seeing quite a bit broader tariff. And then he's obviously been threatening tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and Europe over a variety of trade, as well as non-trade issues. The tariffs he's threatened on the Canadians and the Mexicans, for example, is the threat has been around fentanyl and human trafficking. So just a very, very aggressive use of tariffs that we have not seen, I think, since the 1930s. And I think the question is going to be going forward on this. And Ambassador Froman talked about this. Trump talks about the goals of the tariffs being revenue, industrial, boosting U.S. industrial production, and then leverage for deals. And I think, well, in concept, you can see how you ladder all of those things together. A kind of low-level tariff to create revenue, high product-specific tariffs to encourage onshoring of those particular, products, whether it's semiconductors or pharmaceuticals, and then kind of a, very broad high tariff threat in order to create leverage for deals. In concept, you can see how you ladder that together. At the end of the day, he's going to have to decide how he racks and stacks these things. Is he putting more emphasis on getting deals that'll get, foreigners to lower their trade barriers to the U.S. and maybe give us some geopolitical advantages, or is he going to put more emphasis on the revenue side? And at least from where I sit, and that's why I should go back to Everett, it's not clear to me how he racks and stacks those priorities yet.
Yeah, that was a really outstanding description of kind of where we are. And just to, put another element into that, as we go into this next month, into March and April, there's a number of reports coming out under the America First trade policy agenda that will really set the stage probably for the next 4 years on trade policy, even beyond tariffs. And it is fascinating to watch this, you said racking and stacking, and that is kind of what we're seeing. We've had a number of countries come in, and they unprecedented wanting to come in and talk about, okay, well, what do you want? What can we do to deter the imposition of tariffs on us? So you have ideas that would have been completely off the table on, we're going to, reduce our auto tariff from, say 10% to match yours, which I've been a negotiator at the table, and I've never had that kind of offer, right? So it gives the U.S. incredible leverage to actually push countries to open up markets. So now we have potential agreements, and we'll see if they transpire. United Kingdom, India, and then we've got this renegotiation of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, which was statutory review anyway. So those are definitely, if those land in a good place, that'll incentivize others to come in, and it could ironically end up in more liberalizing space. Now, on the other hand, if it's a revenue raiser, that's a very different dynamic. If Congress starts to use that revenue and raises tariffs statutorily, it is very, very hard to dial that back. Every time you remove a tariff or do a tax cut, or you have to pay for it. And that was something Ambassador Froman had said earlier is, can you do, that has to be actually done. You can't just have the executive branch do it, Congress has to do it. And then you get in that Smoot-Hawley 1930s, statutory tariff dynamic, which can be very, very, very permanent and very damaging. And then the reshoring. I totally agree that this could very well end up where you have a baseline universal tariff with higher tariffs on technology that may go in alignment with export control and perhaps infrastructure investment. You can kind of see how it might come together towards an industrial policy that might not, and its goals look that much different than what the prior administration wanted to do, but in a completely different way.
Can I maybe draw you out on that a little bit, because the president is famous for taking a transactional approach to many different kinds of problems. But Professor Zelikow, made an argument in the previous panel that there is a kind of inchoate or emerging theory of America's role in the world economy. You've hinted at a couple pieces of that, but can you help build that architecture a little bit? What is it, what underpins that vision beyond this kind of, I can build leverage in each individual case? Is there kind of a theory of America's role in the world economy?
I think it's not that different than what it has been. If you go back to, even the foundation of the institutions that we all believe, were unblemished, like the World Trade Organization and others, that we created those. I mean, we were the architect of those. Those were visions. They did not, nobody knew how they were going to work. They evolved over time. I think we're in that kind of a situation now where the U.S. is leading the pathway towards the new economic order. And maybe it's coming about in a different way without, an agreement among countries that this is how we're going to do it. But it's going to evolve. And one thing I've seen under this administration, and I believe this is what's going to transpire in many ways, is that the actions are taken before the concepts are completely gelled, but then institutions and others come in to fill in the gaps, and then you kind of get that coherent framework. So it's almost backwards, but it happens. So what I see happening is more alignment around technology, a continued reindustrialization of the United States, particularly on technology, and the use of economic power to achieve foreign policy objectives in a very transactional way. And I think that's going to continue over the next 3 to 4 years. And then when the next administration comes in, they may use the same tools, but for very different purposes. It might be for climate, it might be for other issues, environmental issues. But I think the general approach is probably the direction is going to be fairly clear for a while.
So it's interesting that you phrase it in that way, because really the first two of those three elements are entirely consistent with the previous administration. The third one, obviously, the style, the transactionalism, and the use of coercive tools as aggressively is different. But the basic thrust is I think, the same. And I guess the question I would ask, I want to get to the risks of this strategy. But I guess the question I would ask is, if we are we, as Ambassador Froman said in the first panel, are we in a kind of revolutionary moment where maybe you're seeing those things because they're the remnants of what was already there? Or is there a greater kind of continuity where they're going to build on the pieces but take a slightly different approach to the way that we deal with our allies and some of our partners? I don't know, maybe, Philip, if I could bring you in to sort of take a stab at that question. How revolutionary is this moment, and what does that tell you about this emerging picture? Is it going to come together is it going to cobble together in a way that's ultimately going to make sense, or is there real risk there? We can't hear you. Philip, you're still muted.
I think it's on our end because this.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
The answer is no one in the Trump administration knows the answer to this question. So I actually like Mr. Eisenstadt's grand strategy very much. That is not the grand strategy of the president. But it's not like the president has an alternative grand strategy. The president's kind of doing what he's doing. I think actually Mr. Eisenstadt knows this. So what he's trying to do is he's basically saying, I can play cleanup among all this debris, and I can use all this debris and this leverage it gives me to construct something that makes sense after the bombers have finished their work. And I think that's a good theory, but that's not the animating theory right now. Right now, the animating theory is about what you see. I think there is a belief out there that the president does all this stuff, but it's actually part of a clever master plan he has that's designed to get to some orchestrated set of objectives. I don't believe that. I don't believe that theory is correct. I believe the president is an open book, and you can read the book, and there's not much more to the book than what you see. Now, underneath the president, there are a lot of officials who have various theories as to how to somehow cobble this together and make it all work. And Mr. Eisenstadt knows who those people are. I know some of them too. And there are a variety of views. And so that's why this morning I was sort of saying, we're at a crossroads. Right now, the default is drifting into the 1920s nationalistic careening. That's the default path we are on. I don't like that path. So my alternative path is to suggest this economic and security commons path. And actually, I then tried to offer a series of arguments that I think I could make to the administration's most fervent supporters that could rally them around that economic and security commons and allow us to implement the kind of theories Mr. Eisenstadt was talking about. But that's not the coherent, purposeful path we are on today. That I'm advocating an effort to basically move towards that path kind of after the bombing raid is passed on. And after people assess the net effects of the destruction, and they decide whether or not they like the way the market looks and they like the way the economy is performing. I think the revenue ambitions are chimerical. The reshoring manufacturing ambitions are chimerical and by the way, I'm all in favor of reshoring what you can. I mean, just do the practical analysis. What's really happening here is you have industries in a number of sectors that are desperate to try to preserve what little market share they have left. Whatever the virtues of their products, it's very hard for their products to be price competitive in an environment where we are running the highest surplus in the capital account in the modern history of the United States. The last time we had the last record period was in 2005, just before we helped cause the global financial crisis. We are now at a level of a surplus in the capital account that is higher than that. The dollar is overvalued by almost any rational expectation in the 20 to 30% range. So at that point, our producers aren't going to be competing much on price. So what they're trying to desperately do is hold on to the market share they have. Maybe in a halcyon moment, you can imagine that some of those producers benefiting from these tariffs are able to increase their market share by a few percent. But we're not talking about using this to achieve any constructive, positive transformation of the U.S. economy. So if the revenue ambitions are chimerical and the reshoring ambitions are basically protective and preservative in a situation where terms of trade face this gigantic headwind in the capital account, you can see that the options left are limited. And then we're trying to construct a grand strategy that can fill in behind all these chaotic impulses.
Do you want to
No,
take a minute to
I
respond?
don't disagree with that at all. I don't. I think that's actually, I mean, that is what we were seeing, and that is the way the president manages policy. I mean, he is not going to sit there and tell you, I am the architect of this grand vision. He's going to tell you, my instincts tell me to do this. And then other people, and you see it even in the Middle East, are going to have to come in and figure out what that means. And I have a little bit of faith that, you know, institutions and people will do that. So I think the president is very powerful, but I don't think he controls all the outcomes. But he's definitely the impetus of the momentum that creates the change and the opportunity to address and perhaps do something constructive with that.
Yeah. All right, so I'd like to, if we can, sort of let's play out. You've, in a sense, articulated two paths. One is the bombing raid and the aftermath. And the other is a kind of, even if it's inchoate right now, a movement towards an economic and security commons, which is a reconfiguration of how America conceptualizes its partnerships economically and from a security perspective around the world. I want to come to the bombing raid second, and I'll turn to you for that. But maybe, Emily, Professor Blanchard, if I can come to you. You served at the State Department. You have a sense of how these issues relate to our diplomacy. When you imagine that economic and security commons, whether in the form that Professor Zelikow laid out or in a modified version, are our allies and partners ready for that compact? Is that a structure that you think others are ready to buy into? Or are we creating, in a sense, a straw man because we're afraid of the alternative?
Yeah, great question, fair question, and a hard one. Well, first, let me say one thing. This conversation's been really great before lunch, but even more so after lunch, as we are deliberately separating tools from objectives. And this is something that I was very much an ingenue when I went to Washington. I was still an ingenue when I left Washington. I was confused all the time. But as a simplistic economist, I just thought, why aren't we talking about what are we trying to do? Like the outcome. So often we spend all of our effort thinking about the tools and the means to some outcome, and I guess we're all supposed to know what that is. The reason I separate this now is it has never been more important for the United States, for our policymakers of whatever political party, of all political parties, well, both political parties, to be crystal clear, here is the global economic landscape that best serves American economic interests. There's a lot of alignment in what are the key features of that economic landscape that works for all of us. Number one, there's to the extent that there are nodes and locuses of geoeconomic power that pass through our adversaries that give them unacceptable points of leverage that expose us to enormous vulnerabilities, like that's not okay. We all agree on that. So let's unknot the global economic fabric that, to the extent it starts to look like a hub and spoke, where the hub is a strategic adversary. So we all agree on that. But then, do we want to be the hub with all the economic power? Or do we want diffuse economic power? And do we want economic power that has sort of closely knit economies or regional economies that are balkanized, say, in different spheres? And this does start to feel very Cold War-esque. And there, I think there's enormous difference within the U.S. administration and around the world. And so you asked, and sorry, Alex, sorry, Professor Bick, I'm sort of answering sideways, but you asked, are our allies with us on our vision? And I think it depends who you ask in the United States about what that vision is. So I think that there's been enormous progress, or I should say enormous change. To me, it strikes me as progress on identifying some of the problems with the, let's say, late 2010 status quo, where especially China's economy did have enormous power. Russia's economy had enormous power through energy in Europe, for example, in ways that maybe our trading partners, maybe the Europeans were a little bit less concerned about than we were. If nothing else, Putin's brutal invasion, further invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 took any illusions out of minds. And I think most of our partners and allies share the diagnosis that we are not in the 1990s anymore, and we're not in the early 2000s anymore, and this is a scary neighborhood, and so we need to bind ourselves more closely together. But then beyond that, I don't think there's clear consensus that we want to create balkanized economies. There's enormous frustration with some of our trading partners around the world. Think about the emergence of the new non-aligned movement. The foreign minister of Singapore, for example, has been incredibly outspoken about, the United States and China cannot make us choose where to be on the global fence. I don't think there's consensus in any of our partners, and again, not even within the United States.
I'll offer an opportunity if anybody else in the panel wants to come in on the question of the vision. I mean, I think about this in a very pedestrian way. When the first Trump national security strategy came out in 2018, it was great power competition and about the military rebalancing that would allow the United States to compete. I think when all of us read this administration's national security strategy, this is the question that we're going to be looking for an answer to. This is going to be the hardest part of that document to write. And so if there are additional elements people want to throw in, what should that section say?
Maybe I'll offer just an analytic point, just sort of watching what I see the president say. And it does seem to me that one of the challenges, I think most of the people around this table, actually most of the people in the national security community, including in the Trump administration, the current Trump administration, I think would all say, ultimately, we do want a vision that is, something in the way that Phil talks about of, we want to kind of have a allied-oriented economic and security world where we have a lot of allies and partners kind of in our sphere, and then there's a Chinese sphere. It is just less clear to me that Trump is prioritizing the security part of that, right? What we see with Trump is he clearly has an economic vision. He has an economic vision around rebuilding U.S. industrial power. He has an economic vision around balancing trade flows, right? I mean, he's very active. He says he wants to have a more balanced trading relationship. This economic vision may or may not be achievable. I'm a lawyer, not an economist, but he very clearly has an economic vision. I think the question I have is he going to be able, or the people around him going to be able to turn that, what I think is first and foremost an economic vision, into an economic and strategic vision, or if we're just going to kind of continue to see an economic focus where he frankly kind of views trade with Canada maybe the same way he views trade with China. They're both ripping us off, and he wants to try to rebalance it. That's just what it looks like to me. It's an econ first right here in his mind, not a security first kind of approach.
Yeah, I would add only that the first Trump administration was, you can call it luck, you can call it political skill and management skill, but was a relatively pacific time in global affairs. We're not there anymore. And I think part of the question that I wrestle with is, as this lurching, or maybe it's more deliberate than I recognize and that Phil recognizes, but as it moves forward, when the security pieces begin to shift underneath, is that kind of lurching sustainable? Or do we get a more dramatic rupture in the way that even those economic questions are being answered? So I think your point's a really, really good one. Yeah.
Alex, can I respectfully disagree with Peter, so I'm turning like this, about the economic vision. It's kind of surprising, right, to see that there is an economic vision, because you try to think about what are we trying to do, what are the big issues, and how America has gotten to where it is. And I didn't write about institutions, but Daron Acemoglu, who won the Nobel laureate last year, wrote extensively about institutions. And what really separates America from clearly the rest of the world is this independence of institutions, and that people feel that actually they can take to court and have a speedy quote-unquote trial if there is some sort of dispute. That's not happening in much of the rest of the world. So that's an important issue. So if I am to go and build something somewhere else, I'm not going to really be able to go to courts, for example. Also, in many countries, what happens is that I want to get reelected, and how do I do this? I tell my central bank to just print stuff and just give it to people, and this is a nice way. We don't have that. Now, the rest of the world has realized that America is America because of the strength of institutions. So if you really want to you have an economic vision for the country, the first thing you do is you do everything in your power to strengthen the institutions you've got. And you make them the best they can possibly be. That's not what we see here. So that's number one. That's number one. Number two, well, let's think about taxes. There's always this idea that, the little bit of the, race to the bottom, of like, we're going to reduce taxes and the world is going to be a happier place. On the other hand, look, I'm not vouching for European kind of taxes. And, I was in Europe over Christmas, and everybody's complaining and everybody's leaving Europe because they pay 50% on income and so on. But the key thing is you have an issue with debt. And how do you bring down the debt to GDP? If that's something, why is debt to GDP important, first of all? Let's start with that. Because the way we fund anything is we issue debt. and we issue debt because other people buy it. Could be a moment where other people might say, we're not buying anymore. There's an intermediate step, which is, I'm not going to buy unless you give me this higher rate. And you saw what happened very recently with inflation, the last 3-4 years. Basically, we used to issue debt at 0, and then the rest of the world will say, I'm going to buy it, although you pay me 0. This is incredible power of America. We have inflation, now it's 4.6. So if we want to basically pay the debt, how we do it, we don't ask for more taxes, because that's so unthinkable in America. So what we do is we issue more debt. So the new debt now is 4.6 versus 0. And so you can see how the debt went from 60% of GDP to 124. So what are the two solutions? You can grow the denominator, right? It's a ratio. So if I grow GDP, the debt to GDP goes down. So that's one thing. How do you do this? Well, you've got to, again, institutions are important. I can't be, one day, I tariff you 10%, the next day I tariff you 20%, the next day I don't tariff you until you bring army to the border, I tariff you this. And not that the markets are always right, I admit to this, but I look to the markets to see how they react. And I'll tell you how they react to tariffs. And this is what I would call policy uncertainty. I mean, Phil calls it the bombing state or something like that. It's what's fascinating, Alex, as I watch our president in the presidency one, he would talk about the stock market all the time. This was it. You look at the stock market. Meanwhile, the 50% of the people who are not in the market because they can't, because they live paycheck to paycheck, they're not really, taking advantage of that. So the rest of us who are in the market, we're happy. But now he has stopped talking about the market. Why? Because, well, you could see, 5 weeks ago, it was at 4,400. It was at 44,000. Now it's like 43, 42. Every time there is a tariff thing, the market goes down. Why? Well, what is the problem with tariffs? The big problem with tariff is two things. One is, as Philip said, it may achieve nothing. The second thing is it could be inflationary, as we all know, right? So now I'm going to buy, this is the interesting thing, I'm going to buy a GM car. And that could be more expensive. Why? Because the GM car is not done in Detroit. It basically has widgets in Ontario, widgets in Mexico. They're going to be more expensive, so everything's going to be more expensive. And so the people who buy GM cars are going to now face with higher prices. And in fact, the key thing I watched was the Fed. They're really probably pausing any kind of reduction of interest rate. So essentially, they also feel that this thing, uncertainty is the enemy. And so this thing can cause inflation, and then you know what happens. How do you tame inflation? You jack up interest rates. So again, that feeds back to debt. And so now our debt is going up instead of down, and on top of that, we want to basically make the tax cuts permanent, which basically will more increase our debt. So let me not talk about regulatory issues on the markets, because essentially the rest of the market, what do they think? This is going to be a boondoggle. It's beautiful. I'll tell you an example. I wrote a case on Capital One and Discover Financial, and I'm gonna stop here. So this case is basically the number 2 credit card buying a very highly, I don't know, number 4, 5, whatever, credit card. It wasn't clear that they were going to be able to consummate this deal. It was like when they announced it last March, it was about 50-50. And why? Because they were going to be the top credit card. So basically, and I don't know if you know how much they charge. A credit card charges 29% if you don't pay. It's incredible. Who pays 29%? Much of this audience probably pays every month and it's just used for payments. But the audience that doesn't have the money, they pay 29%. Now, if you consolidate that, they're going to charge even more, okay? So the previous administration was actually kind of skeptical about this, and clearly the market saw it. It's not clear that we're going to get this done. What happened November 6th? Capital One stock price went up 18%. What does this tell you? Wow, the markets think really that this is going to be a great environment for M&A. I tell my students, I just taught M&A this quarter, you guys are going to be very busy. It's going to be great. If you're at Goldman Sachs, it's going to be great for all this. Is it going to be great for America? That is the question. And then I can layer on things about crypto, things that don't make sense, on and on. I see no economic vision.
Okay. Do you,
Okay.
Henry, do you want to respond? Then I do want to turn the conversation to a couple more specific.
Okay, and I'll try to be super quick. I do agree on the crypto thing, and I think one of the really important questions for American economic security strategy is what happens when crypto is setting the agenda for what happens and what does not. It used to be that economic security people, I think, really had a dominant voice in previous administrations. Now they're going to be fighting in a casino against a variety of other factions. But what I want to do is to try and bring together what Everett said earlier and what Jorgis just said now at the beginning about institutions and about Daron and Simon's view of how institutions work and so on, and bring it together with economic coercion. So if you look at how the United States, how the Trump administration has really built out executive power over the last few weeks, it has done to the United States political system what the United States did to the global system. What do I mean by that? So if you think about US financial power, economic security power over the last couple of decades, it has been built upon taking these incredibly boring infrastructural systems that nobody paid attention to. Nobody who was not a banker cared about dollar clearing system. Nobody who was not in the financial system cared about SWIFT. Nobody who was not a real geek cared about how supply chains worked. All of these are incredibly boring. They're the plumbing of the global system, but the plumbing can be politicized, and the United States has figured out various ways to really turn this into a set of economic weapons that allow it to shape agendas much, much more broadly. That is what has been happening with the Trump administration and executive power over the last few weeks. It has begun to take all of these boring infrastructural systems, the systems through which Treasury pays things, the OMB, and it has started, I think, in a very clear sense, to weaponize them and to use them to achieve things that an executive, previous executives have not been able to achieve because they have effectively firewalled off these systems from political control. So I think that there is a real question about what happens next. It could be, as Everett said, that we begin to see pushback from the courts, perhaps certainly from Democrats if they manage to get their act together, possibly from some Republicans as well. It could also be that the court decides to shrug its shoulders in a situation where J.D. Vance has sort of more or less made threats. If you try to do this, we are going to push the nuclear button. And then we're faced with a system in which it is possible to use all of these boring seeming systems in order to really exert on sort of much, much greater power. So take a look at this famous example in which the US has, over the last few weeks, has tried to use its ability to, effectively it's done an ACH reversal on on $800 million, which was sent to New York State, and so basically grabbed the money back. How exactly it has done this, Citibank does not want to disclose, but it is, it sounds pretty damn sketchy. And we're now also in a world where $20 billion is being held and sort of frozen apparently by Citibank because the US administration is trying desperately to figure out some way that they can make a case that the Biden administration dispersed this money fraudulently. And we have seen resignations of US government attorneys who do not want to touch this radioactive case with a barge pole. So I think we're really in a very interesting, complex situation where all of these, nobody cares about financial payments. Nobody thinks that payment systems are going to be used within the United States against political adversaries. That is changing, and whether or not we see pushback against that is going to really, I think, shape some of what Jorgis was saying at the beginning about the ability of the United States to promise to other people, we are not going to politicize these systems, so there is going to be rule of law. We're going to see if that happens. We're going to see if that works.
Okay, so just to sort of catalog the conversation up to this point in terms of risks, we've talked about institutions and the kind of plumbing of America's economic power and the potential loss of strategic leverage over time. We've talked about taxes and debt as a risk and area of vulnerability. We've talked about uncertainty in the business environment, and we've talked about the way that allies and partners might react to much stronger economic coercion coming from the United States. I want to pivot from that because I think we could have a whole conversation about to what extent those are areas where we could present mitigation measures. I'm not sure that this is the moment for that conversation. What I want to turn to is one of the specific pieces, which is about technology and China. And we heard from Ambassador Froman at the beginning of the conversation about this Biden administration policy of a small yard and a high fence. In other words, an approach which tried to control the dispersion and concentrate cutting-edge technologies in the United States and with our allies and partners while maintaining an open, largely open trading relationship with China. So again, this is the small yard with the high fence. And maybe, Peter, I could turn to you. Is that still the approach? Is that approach appropriate to this moment?
So maybe just begin for folks who sort of didn't follow the Biden administration's development here by summarizing, building a little bit on what you said, Alex, what the Biden administration strategic approach here. So the Biden administration, when it thought about China, saw a strategic competitor, but thought that the way we were going to maintain our edge and outcompete China over the long term was going to be by sort of keeping a qualitative edge in advanced technology, in economic size, and in sort of alliance structures without actually having to, or without trying to kind of tip China into its own decline. It was kind of, they are going to grow, we're going to try and keep them from leveraging our stuff to grow, and we're going to grow faster. It was kind of the strategic concept. When it came to technology, and against this sort of backdrop of we're not trying to actually tip them into decline, the strategic approach was essentially, as you say, Alex, we're going to have a small yard with a high fence on it, which means there are going to be a small number of key technology products or sectors, basically, where we are going to use a variety of quite extensive restrictions to make sure China can't get access to that technology. But the vast majority of trade would be allowed to compete, and investment and the like would be allowed to continue unimpeded. And the Biden administration developed a couple of different tools sets to be able to do this. So the Biden administration, I think, first sort of identified a couple of these key technologies, particularly sort of AI, artificial intelligence, quantum technology, a variety of things that were more in the defense kind of space. And the Biden administration said, so first of all, we're going to steadily ratchet up export controls so that China can't acquire this technology from the United States or from US firms. They also, in 2023, imposed investment restrictions so that American funds couldn't invest in these technologies in China to help the Chinese develop their own indigenous capabilities. So that was kind of the strategic concept, but again, leaving lots of things untouched. I think that this proved hard for the Biden administration and would prove hard going forward. I'll come to the Trump administration in a second, but under any administration, because there was never, although it's a nice sort of concept as an elevator pitch, there was never any clear vision about what the end of this was. And so what we saw in the years after, a couple of years after National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan laid this out, was a steady growth in the size of the yard that people in the administration, across the administration, wanted to protect. And I think that was because as we got into more and more intense competition with China because of political pressures, because of geopolitical pressures, there's a sort of relentless pressure to control more. And without this kind of clear vision of what the end state is, the yard expanded. I mean, I'm reminded, and it became an issue with our allies and partners as well, who saw this happening. I remember once going over to Brussels to talk about technological controls with the Europeans, And this European official pulled out to me, showed me a phone of a European chateau with, acres and acres of lawn around it. He's a chateau on a hill with acres and acres of lawns, and he said, "This is the Biden administration's yard, isn't it?" And I think that sort of illustrates the strategic challenge the administration faced. I actually think I won't, I would defer to others on what the Trump administration, in fact, does. I don't think that's the vision they have right now. I think many of the people, when I talk to the people I know in the Trump administration, they actually see a more expansive and would sort of forthrightly embrace we should be cutting off quite a bit more. They would also, I think, many of them say, actually this idea that the goal should be select areas of decoupling, of maintaining our edge, is the wrong goal. We should actually have a much more expansive goal of decoupling kind of across the board and ideally tipping China into recession and decline. I mean, this even came up in the first panel. Foreign Affairs magazine had an article by Matt Pottinger and others a couple of months ago, which is like the end state should be victory, not maintaining kind of a qualitative edge over time.
Do you want to respond? Either do you want to respond?
I'm not sure.
No, I'm happy to throw out some thoughts on it, but I think I think there's a lot of validity to that. We'll have to see. We're still early in the administration. We'll have to see what the export control policy is. There's definitely a school of thought that any investment in Chinese technology is bad investment for the United States from a national security perspective. I think that's probably the dominant thread, but we'll see. There's also a sense that we want Chinese investment in the United States, which also kind of goes counter to that because that requires some technology transfer and some access to U.S. technology as well. So I think those threads are definitely a little bit in tension. But I think that at the end of the day, it's probably going to go the direction you say, which is more restrictive. And with an effort to not just maintain control of the technology, but to diminish the ability of China to grow and compete against the United States.
And this is an area of potential leverage for the Trump administration because the Chinese are not prepared to decouple.
Well, they can't.
They can't.
I mean,
let me go and dig a little bit deeper on a specific aspect of this, which is the artificial intelligence piece. We talked a little bit about it in the previous panel. But as AI has become is beginning to revolutionize so many aspects of our society and our understanding of so many of the challenges that we face, it's really accelerated and added fuel to this conversation about export controls and about to what extent we want to allow China to benefit from U.S. technology. But it's also become increasingly intertwined with the question of Taiwan. And this is to bring some of the geopolitical dimensions back into the conversation. Taiwan is a major geopolitical, political, strategic problem for the United States, but it's also the main source of the highest caliber semiconductors that are produced globally. And so these issues are beginning to be intertwined in ways that I think are not necessarily self-evident, or at least there are competing views on. Phil, could I maybe turn to you to offer your thoughts on what is the relationship between the geopolitical and the economic strategy here? How are these problems becoming intertwined, and how should we think about the solutions to those problems?
Well, there are just two basic issue streams that I hope folks will connect. There's one giant issue stream having to do with the future of AI and the digital revolution in the American economy. Everyone in this room knows how a large portion of the US stock market and the S&P 500 is now being dominated by expectations about AI and the digital revolution and the scales of investment that are now underway there. And there's a large agenda having to do with AI security, and then the issue of export controls and so forth. There is another whole issue stream having to do with China and Taiwan. And there's a notion that we can have a race for AI supremacy and that China's going to be kind of philosophical about how that turns out. We here are arguing that the American government ought to make this a maximum priority effort And we're acting as if the Chinese government isn't really going to care so much. So then if you think the Chinese government does care, there are kind of like two possibilities, and only two. One is that the Chinese feel pretty good that they're going to win this AI race. Two, Chinese government feeling not so confident it will win AI race. Now, it could decide AI race is not important and who cares, but I don't think that's a serious possibility. So suppose the Chinese think that they might not win this AI race. They're not so confident. Well, the Chinese government has options. It has options. And a lot of its options are really close to China. So we're now in the process of reworking our export controls. And we're probably going to extend the Biden administration export controls and possibly significantly expand them, including maybe to the H20 chips and some other things. And in the previous panel, we called out, for instance, the example of the ARM company in the UK. And I mentioned very briefly at the end that the ARM company, has about 6,000 employees, half of whom are in England, and it basically does a lot of design work. But the foundries that make the things that they design are in East Asia, principally TSMC in Taiwan. Well, China has a lot of leverage over what happens with TSMC in Taiwan. And these are not options that have to do with invasion and blowing things up. They have a lot of other options that are not very much discussed in the public media, but which I think the Chinese government understands. And so the notion is that we have this whole AI issue stream and all these expectations and policies and export controls, yet there's a China-Taiwan issue stream that is probably going to connect up with the AI issue stream, and probably will connect up with it sometime this year, I believe, and in which China has really large options about which the American national security community barely even discusses, and which I think are not incorporated into the market expectations for the future role of their investments.
Emily, could I give you a chance to respond?
I'm just cogitating. That's the confidence with which you've laid that out, Professor Zelikow, is sobering, and I'm just updating my priors. No, this is a big deal. But what I will say is just a quick comment on this. Not that I could do better than that, but is, our temptation, our desire to somehow separate issue streams because we want to deal with things in orthogonal or little separate silos. That's nice. Life would be easy if it worked that way, but none of this works that way. And so I will say there seems to be a fallacy often where this administration, the smart people in many administrations over many time periods will be tempted to deal with different issues in sort of stovepipes, and likewise to sort of try to separate things, and also to try to imagine that we get the last vote in our policy action and that others aren't going to respond. So I think precisely the right question to be asking here is, if and as, because it's not if, as the United States continues to strengthen and lock down access by China or by Chinese firms to U.S. technology in semiconductors, how do we think Beijing is optimally going to respond to that? We know that they're investing a great deal, but what else are they going to do? And I guess that's precisely what are those other choices on the menu for Beijing? I don't think we spend enough time thinking about those either.
Yeah, those are great points, and I think it's an illustration also really where you ended of two things. One is that there are military timelines, which those people who think about military affairs are contemplating, which are being potentially accelerated or decelerated by decisions being made about questions of economic statecraft. As you say, these are often just dealt with by different people in the U.S. government. That's not true, obviously, at the level of the president, in some cases, the National Security Advisor and others. But there is a challenge to have people who have sufficient understanding and technical sophistication in some of the economic and technology issues, alongside those who have equal sophistication in questions of military strategy and operations, and for those conversations to meet in a meaningful way. And so this was flagged in the last panel, but I do want to come back to it. Because it is about American institutions, about the institutions that manage economic statecraft. So if Ambassador Froman is right, that effectively after a period where economic policy and geopolitical strategy could comfortably be, not separated, but comfortably operate in relatively different spheres. If today those two things have, if there's a confluence between those two, a meaningful and real confluence between those two things, does the United States government have, and not just the government, but the government in partnership with the private sector, have the institutions that enable us to carry out and design economic statecraft in a way which brings all of these problems together effectively? So I'm going to ask that question to a couple different people. Everett, I'd like to start with you because you sat at the pinnacle of that system not that long ago. I don't think it's changed remarkably in the time since then. But are we fit for purpose? And if not, what should we be doing?
No, it's a great question, and it really goes back to even where we began with Ambassador Froman's remarks. It's like, first, are we asking the right questions? Are we focused on the right things? And when you get in that siloed, everybody's got a mission, right? And when you get into those siloed mandates, you tend to lose the ability to see beyond what you're supposed to be studied and acting upon. And I think what Emily Blanchard said about the inability, this siloed mentality and the government's inability to see the multi-dimensional aspects of a problem and the way national security and economic security are really merging together is a very serious vulnerability in our governance structure. And I think one of the ways we need to, and hopefully this will spur some of this discussion, is if you think about institutions like even the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, right? Before 1970, it didn't exist. It started out as one thing, it evolved over time. It's actually a very interesting, the structure made a difference, and it was kept small for a reason. It was kept in the White House for a reason. It was multifunctional in some ways, but also very specific mandates for some negotiators in other ways. And it really works well. And then you go to Inticon, where Peter worked and I worked, and Ambassador Froman worked, which merges national security and national security and economics together. It sits between NSC and the National Economic Council. That's a brilliant structure. I mean, it's really one of the few areas where you bring those and meld them together. What we don't have is a congressional counterpart. And I think, Congress creates institutions. Congress is able to set up the structures, fund them, give them mandates, give them authority. And I hope that we will see a push towards some type of realignment of the current institutions we have, and perhaps an economic statecraft element to maybe even it's an interagency, starts as an interagency working group, I don't know. But it has to start somewhere, and then maybe it melds into a more formalized structure, because that's the world we're in, and I don't think the institutions we have are really fit to deal with that. You've got the China Commission, which is focused on the China, but I would love to see that perhaps become an economic security commission that took into a lot of these concepts about financial, the debt, all these really existential problems, and thinking about them in a holistic way and making recommendations that might drive some really concrete policy outcomes.
Philip, can I ask the same question to you, but taking a historical perspective? There have been moments in American history where, Second World War being the most obvious, but other periods also, where we've done this. How did we do it?
Well, in the Second World War, actually, the British created a Ministry of Economic Warfare that actually had that name. And then they had a cabinet committee set up that was the war cabinet that was actually extremely well designed to do the higher level staff work to actually implement this sort of thing coherently. The Americans actually, during the war, began imitating these sorts of models with various kinds of offices, or no need to, it was really a complex alphabet soup. No need to recount that. After the war, when we originally created the National Security Council, it was done in significant part to bring in the economic institutions and to actually allow for things like resource mobilization. This is all forgotten now because scholars concentrated on different things, but actually the key person who was behind the creation of the U.S. National Security Council was a man named Ferdinand Eberstadt. If you look at who Eberstadt was, during the war, Eberstadt had been one of the key resource managers, oil and other things for the U.S. government, was dismayed at the way we were organized to coordinate that sort of thing, and helped lead the charge to create a thing called the National Security Council. Well, as Alex knows very well, you can see how that institution has evolved to the present day. And really what we need is almost to kind of roll the clock back and recover the original purpose for which the NSC was created in the first place. There was actually a thing back then called an Office of Economic Mobilization and other entities that were designed to help us get ready for a potential Third World War that are all now, you know, only a handful of historians know these things even existed. I'm sorry there are little bells going off in the background on my end because there's a hurricane going on around the Oval Office right now for reasons you may not be aware of in the news, but which a lot of people are contacting me about, having to do with Ukraine. But meanwhile, away from where today's bombing rate is going on, we're kind of talking about how to reorganize the U.S. government, but I'll make one final point. Historically, people assume the United States will play a key leadership role in working on these things and providing thought leadership. That assumption's gone. This president, let's suppose we all agree kind of on the theory that I've been talking about, or Mr. Eisenstadt's been discussing about how things ought to be reconstructed and that that's a good idea. This president will actually not provide the thought leadership to create such a plan. So there's one theory in which other Americans will kind of pick up the debris mostly outside of the issues that interest the president that day, and they will cobble something together. That's one theory, and maybe it will work. I don't know. Another theory, though, is I think we're going to have to look to leadership from foreign partners in order to provide thought leadership for the creation of this new economic and security commons. Some of them are not accustomed to that role. It is worth remembering that the thought leadership to create the North Atlantic Organization came from Britain. The thought leadership actually that helped stimulate the creation of the Marshall Plan in part originated from Britain and the continent. And actually the engineering as to how the Marshall Plan would actually work was substantially done in Europe. So this is a situation in which actually a lot of the design of the economic and security commons may have to emerge from others and then try to bring the United States along in ways that are more or less outside of the bandwidth and attention span of the leader of the United States.
Interesting. Okay. I want to take one question that's from the audience and give folks a chance to respond and then offer closing comments. We won't do a lightning round, although that was raucous and fun. We won't do that for this one. The question that came in is how is U.S. innovation being protected? And I might flip that and say, how should U.S. innovation be protected? What are some concrete areas where we might be able to better protect this innovation ecosystem?
So I think this is a third set. I think we heard about some very interesting trade-offs during the day. So we heard Ambassador Froman at the beginning talking about efficiency versus national security. Professor Blanchard has talked about how it is that we're dealing with dual-use technologies and the complicated trade-offs that involves. When we think about trade-offs that involve innovation, I guess we actually don't think about trade-offs that involve innovation because we don't have very good theories of how even to begin to think about this in the first place. And this is, I think, sort of what Mr. Harrell said in a sense, which is if you're trying to do a small yard high fence policy and you don't have a theory of what a foundational technology is in the first place, and I've never heard a theory of what a foundational technology is in the first place, you're inevitably going to get policy drifting in all of these ways because you don't have a clear intellectual framework to nail this down. And so I think so fundamentally the problem is a lot of US national security at the moment and global national security depends on questions of how technological innovation is going to proceed over the longer term. Economists think about this in a kind of weird way. Some technologists think about it also in a weird way. Political scientists don't even think about it at all. We're just plainly too stupid to have theories that even begin to get at it. But we haven't begun to think about really how this intersects with national security in a substantial sense. So the obvious path, which I think is the path that we are primarily pursuing, is the path of cutting things off. So that, for example, yes, we have the China Commission, of course, has done a lot of recommendations, which are more or less the high fence should be expanding outwards at the 89% of the speed of light, so that there's substantial redshift visible. You have all of the, you have this very immediately protectionist question. The other way in which you can think about this is, to what extent does innovation depend upon contact with other countries? And the difficult question is, are we in a world where there are some forms of innovation where we actually would benefit from continued coupling to China? And here I think the connected electric vehicles question is a very interesting question. More or less the United States has shut this down nominally for national security reasons. Actually, I think for economic security reasons, because the US simply isn't able to compete with China on electric vehicles at the moment. The upside of that, if you want to see an upside, is a kind of a Friedrich List 19th century upside, which is that might give the United States the opportunity to build its own infant industry up. The downside is that it might find itself completely cut off from this economic race and this technological race which is happening in the rest of the world, where perhaps China on this and a variety of other connected technologies in the stack is really able to build up a package of technologies that the United States finds itself cut off from, especially in a world where the Trump administration is hostile to these technologies from the get-go. So I'm not saying this is not, I'm not saying we connect to China. I'm saying we do not have the frameworks to even begin to figure out those kinds of trade-offs between disconnection in order to protect ourselves from certain kinds of innovation risks, or increased connection in order to make sure that we are in the game and actually connected into the infrastructures in which we cannot depend on United States technological supremacy anymore as a basic orienting fact of the global system.
Okay, so that gets at the issue of connection, right? But there's another issue, which is domestic investment, right? And to the extent there was a theory of the case on innovation in the Biden administration, it involved the CHIPS and Science Act, it involved the IRA. The Inflation Reduction Act. These were huge investments that were supposed to support not only basic science, but specifically areas of innovation, in some of them, well, multiple areas of innovation. Very quickly, because we only have really a minute left, is there, in this fiscal environment, in this political environment, is there a big piece of legislation for the Trump administration to put forward that would be if not a successor, they wouldn't want to call it that, but that would take up that mantle? We have about 60 seconds. Emily, please.
So I have a quick two-finger. This isn't legislation, though. I would just, echoing Henry, but pushing it further, innovation is a flow. And often we talk about protecting the stock of technology, but the goal is to maximize our output of the flow of new innovation, the flow of new development. And I would say the most important thing that the Trump administration can do in protecting our innovation ecosystem is not break it. And there, number one, don't cut grants to fundamental development and technology. It's really hard to guess what is going to be the foundational technology that spurs, that launches 1,000 more ships in in innovation. So we must continue to invest in core investments in R&D, especially universities, NSF, et cetera. So don't shut that down. If nothing else, just double down. Just keep investing in core research and keep bringing in the smartest people from all around the world to contribute to our innovation ecosystem. Just don't ruin it.
Terrific. I want to thank the panelists for joining us here, for their thoughts, for a really excellent discussion. Please join me in offering.